Alright, so I will walk through a tutorial on how to write an R script to create tidy and clean raw data files from a messy raw data file. Some things you will need to have done before starting this video tutorial is install the workflow package. So you can see how to do so here in the useRguide. And I'm assuming that you have at least some familiarity with using dplyr. And if you don't, then you can see the chapter data manipulation using dplyr. Okay. So one thing to note is it's always good when you are going to work in R to open up RStudio by opening up an R project file rather than opening up a blank RStudio instance. So I've already done so here. RStudio with the RStudio project name. You can see what's going on here. You can even open up different RStudio projects in this tab here, so that's kind of nice. In different windows of RStudio. Okay, so it should open up to where your directory is, where your project file is located. And if we go into data files, and then there's nothing here, but if we go to the merge folder, we see a txt file. This is a tab delimited text file that was exported from an emerged ePrime data file. And this is the data corresponding to an arrow flanker adaptive response deadline task. And this is a messy data file. We're going to create a nice, clean, tidy raw data file and save it here. So if we go into our scripts folder, we can see that it is blank. So we need to create an R script to do this. One way of creating a new R script is going to File, New File, R script. I almost never do this just because it's like, okay, where do I start out? What's the first line of code? What should I start typing? It's like when you're writing up a document, it's like, okay, where do I start? It's just kind of hard to start with something that's blank. So I suggest either starting from templates or scripts that are already made by you or someone else. I've made it quite easy to download some templates for common scripts that we use in the lab here. And so we can download a raw script template from the workflow package just by typing in this line of code in the console and running it. You can see that it downloaded something, and also now there's a templates folder in the R scripts folder. And there is the template R script. And now it's already filled out for us, so we don't have to think about where do I need to start out. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is go to File, Save As, and go ahead and save this template to the name of the task that you're working with. And in this case, Visual Flanker DL. And save it in the R scripts folder, not in the templates. So one directory up. Yep, and so this is what we're working with now. So there's four chunks of code in this template that you need to just be aware of. There's the setup block, the import block, the tidy raw data block, and the output block. So we can go through each of these one at a time. Okay, the setup block is just I'd like to put this stuff at the top. That way you can really quickly see what packages are required, where you're importing and outputting data files to, what task you're working with, without having to go into the code down below. You can right away see some of this important information. You might need to add additional packages, but these three are pretty standard. And so you really don't need to change much up here or even in the input-output directories unless you have a different file organization. You will need to change the task name corresponding to what task you're working with and the way the data file is named. So here in this case it is Visual Space Flanker DL. You don't need to type the extension because the extension will actually be added here. So we're specifying the import file and output file. We're importing a text file and we're going to want to output a CSV file. Comma separated files are easier to import into R than tab delimited files. Same thing with a lot of other programs, so we like to save them as CSV files. Okay, so that's the setup block. The import block, you don't need to change anything really at all, unless you're not working with a tab delimited file or an ePrime file. But if you are working a tab delimited or ePrime file, this can stay exactly the same. So one thing nice about these templates is that all we had to do was change this one line here, and we can already import our data really quickly. we've only made one minor change, and so we can go ahead and run these lines of code and import the data. And so now we have our raw data into R. And so this is the messy raw data file that ePrime creates. There's a bunch of column names that don't make any sense, way too many columns. It's actually 115 columns, way more than we would ever need. Okay, and so again, just so you like to save your script as often as possible. And so yeah, so we were able to do that really quickly, getting into our data. The next block here, the tidy raw data block, is where the action is happening, right? This is where you're going to have to make a lot of changes. And a few things that you will need to do really almost every time you are cleaning up a messy raw data file is you might want to rename some columns. You're probably going to want to filter out some rows. You want to change some values inside of columns, or maybe even create new columns. And you will definitely want to select only a subset of columns, right, from these 115 columns. It's way too many. And you're probably always going to have too many columns. So I'll go ahead and delete that just so it doesn't distract us here. So, so it's hard to navigate the data frames in RStudio. They're kind of slow and sluggish, right? And so, you know, trying to find column names can be a little bit painful to have to scrolling and switching back and forth between the script and the data file. So one thing I like to do is print out the column names of the data frame into the console by typing column names data underscore import, and we can see now it printed out all the 115 column names. So now we can see them really easily while working on the script at the same time. And we can even copy and paste column names into the script. That way we don't make typos. So I definitely suggest doing that. Okay, so one of the column names that if you're using an ePrime file, at least, you're definitely going to need to work with is the procedure trial column. Sometimes it might be procedure block, but this column tells you whether you're in instruction procedure or practice or the actual task procedure in the ePrime program, right, and in the data file. And so we can go ahead and take a look at what are the values that are in there. Do we have, because a lot of times if you're going to want to filter out some rows, you'll know based off of what values are in this column. Okay, so let's find the procedure trial column. Okay, and all right, so we have some response map proc, no deadline proc, trial proc, and we have this rest proc. So we don't really care about there's not really any data that we really need from here. And so we can get rid of this row is one thing that we're going to want to do. But actually before we do the filtering out some rows, this column name, notice that it's a little hard to type because you need these special little characters here, and you also need brackets. And so let's go ahead and just rename that because we're going to need to reference that column name quite a few times in the script. And so let's just do a simple rename. Let's rename it trial proc is equal to the procedure trial. Okay, and if we go ahead and run that line of code now, we created a new object called data underscore raw. You can see it up here as well. So now let's get the column names in data underscore raw. And we can see that that column was renamed to trial proc. So that worked. It did what we wanted it to do. Okay, so now we can filter out some of these rows corresponding to these values in the column, right? So let's get rid of the rest proc rows. So there's more values here that we want than compared to what we don't want. So it's easier to specify what we don't want than specifying everything that we do. And so when we use filter, we can just do trial proc. So anything in trial proc does not equal to rest proc, let's keep. This is an inclusive filter, right? So I typed it out, but you can actually, again, just copy and paste from here to make sure you're not making typos. Okay, and if we run that, now it should have gotten rid of those rows. One, you can see up here that actually, yes, the number of rows was reduced. We have fewer rows, so it seems like it did what we want. You like to always double check your work. because we make mistakes, and sometimes coding is difficult, so sometimes we think we're typing out to do one thing when really it does something else. And so you like to double check your work all the time. Yep, we no longer have the restproc value in that column anymore. So we got rid of those rows. All right. Another thing that you will oftentimes want to do is change values in certain columns. And especially if you're keeping practice columns, practice rows corresponding to practice and real trials, this might happen in your ePrime data file where actually the performance variables for practice and the performance variables for the real trials in the task are stored in different columns. So like accuracy for practice is stored in different columns than accuracy for the actual task. And that's the case here. And I know this because I know this data file. Really the time-consuming part of creating a raw script in R is figuring out your data file and what columns you want and where all the information's at. So I spent time and I already know what's going on here. So for the so I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but for the these two practice trials, they are stored in the no deadline arrows, and for the other practice trial and the real trials are stored in these arrows. So accuracy is in two different columns. We want accuracy in one column. We want response in one column. We want reaction time in one column, regardless of whether they're in practice or the real trials. Okay, so keep that in mind. I was getting actually a little bit ahead of myself. First, let's go ahead and just change these values to make it a little bit more sense and easier to read. This one is actually a practice trial, but it doesn't even have the word practice in it. This one is the same name as the column name, so like what does that mean, right? So we can go ahead and do that first before working on the performance variables. So mutate, we want to work with this column trial proc, right? Changing the values in trial proc to being using case when, and when trial proc is equal to, let's start with the first one, response map proc. So this is the practice when they're doing the response mapping. So let's just name it. Oops, that was the wrong notation there. Little tilde. Let's name it practice response mapping, because that's what they're doing. They're just figuring out what button to press for left arrow and what button to press for right arrow. We can work on the next one. And if you're unfamiliar with how to use case when, you like to see the chapter on data manipulation using dplyr to kind of figure this out here. I'm not explaining how this works. I'm just assuming you have some familiarity with it. So this is the practice when they're doing just a regular flanker with no response deadline whatsoever. Right. Okay. So we can just name it practice no response deadline. And you like to make your value labels as clear as possible. These actually aren't very concise. We don't really care about being concise, especially in a raw data file. You know, you might be sharing your raw data file with other people, or you might be going back to your own raw data files months or years down the line. You want to know what's going on, and so be as clear as possible. You don't have to be concise. That's okay. Okay, so trial proc is equal to the next one here, deadline practice proc, tilde. Practice is still practice, but now this is a practice with a response deadline. So practice response deadline. Okay, next one and final one. Not getting any typos here. So when trial proc is equal to trial proc, let's set this as real. Okay, so we have some rows that are going to be having the word practice in them and a row that's having real. So these are the real trials for the task. All right, so we can go ahead and run these lines of code. And when we do the unique, we see that those values have now been renamed from what they were before, right? They were this before, and now they are with these labels. So again, this is just double checking that we did what we expected to be going on. Okay, sorry. Okay, so now let's move on to the response thing. Sorry, I was getting ahead of myself before. So basically, we want to get the response performance variable into one column. Right now they're in nodeadlinearrows.resp and arrows.resp. And so actually these two practice trials are in the no deadline arrows, and this practice and the real trials are in the arrows. So response, again using case when trial proc is equal to this one, or trial proc is equal to this one. So in either of these cases, we want to set the value in this column, and actually this is a completely new column we're creating because there's not a column already called response. We want the value in this new column to be called, not to be called anything, but to take whatever is currently in this column, right? So basically just copying that over. All right, and then the next one is when trial proc is equal to this one, or trial proc is equal to real trials, then we want to set it to the arrows.resp. Where is it? There it is. Okay. All right, so now we will have the response all in one column. And we can make sure that it did what we wanted to do. Oops, that's not what we're doing here. So unique data underscore raw in response. All right, so now they're in one column. If we check before, like the other one of the other columns, like the no deadline arrows, there's gonna be some missing values because some of those rows in this column correspond to the practice response deadline or the real trials, in which there is nothing stored in there because those are stored in a different column. And so you see there's a missing value. Now we don't have any missing values because everything's in one column. So that's good, that's what we want. And now we can also see that actually the values inside of this column though don't really make much sense unless you know that Z corresponds to our left response on our keyboard and this corresponds to our right response on our keyboard. We shouldn't expect people or our future selves to be able to know that. So let's go ahead and change that to make more sense. So when response is equal to Z, set this to left response, and when response is equal to the slash, that corresponds to your right response. So just really simple, easy labels is all we need there. Double check our work. Response, yep, now the values in there are left and right. Okay, so there's a bunch of other things that we will need to do for this data file, this messy data file, but basically it's more or less the same thing that we just did with the response, so we don't need to go through everything. Like we would need to do that for the accuracy, the reaction time, some other variables. So I'm just going to copy and paste some script that I have, some lines of code that I have from a different script. So basically just fast forwarding through this here. So basically just added the same thing for accuracy, correct response, reaction time, trial, response deadline, and other stuff. So if we run that line of code, it executed properly. This is just a warning message, it's not an error message. Just letting us know that, you know, did you mean to do this on purpose? Yeah, we did. We don't need to get into that though. Okay, you can see we actually now have more columns than we did before because we created some new ones. So once you've changed the values in columns, maybe filtered some rows, renamed some column names and whatnot, the last thing we really need to do is select only a subset of these. 118 columns is way too many. And so in this task, there's actually quite a few columns that we need to keep, probably more than other tasks. And so I'm just going to copy and paste this from another script I have open. And this is another area that takes some time. You really need to think about which columns should you keep and which can you get rid of. You want to try to keep everything, not just that you need immediately for your analysis right now, but anything that you can see that you possibly might want to look at in the future. So it's a balance of, you don't want too much in this clean, tidy raw data file, but you don't want too little as well. Okay. So this has a lot of columns just because there's a lot corresponding to the adaptive nature of the task. So, but we don't need to get into that. All right. So if you run lines of code now with that select added there, you can see now we've reduced our data frame to 22 columns only. That's quite nice. And so let's go ahead and take a look at it. We can see that it's much shorter. That's the end of it already. And when you open it up, you can just immediately see where the trials are at, where the accuracy variable is at, reaction time, what response they were making, the flanker type. It's just immediately right there on the screen. Easy to see. You can see whether it's a practice procedure or they're now in the real trials. So whereas in the messy data file, getting that information, maybe you see subject information is important, but it's like, okay, well, where's everything else? It's hard to start your data analysis from here. And so creating these clean, tidy, raw data files is just setting us up so that once we do get to data analysis, we can do so much more easily. Okay. Let's save that script right, of course. Okay, oh yes, and the last thing is the output block. And you don't need to change anything here whatsoever. And so you can just run the last 2 lines of code there. And what you'll see is if we go to data files, now we outputted this to our output directory, which was data files. There's now a clean and raw tidy data file here, right? This is what we just created. Yeah, same thing. Yeah, and so that is how to write an R script using this template.